Podcasting Q&A for July 31st, 2017. I'm Daniel J. Lewis. Got some good questions here that I will answer for you about how to get your episode artwork to show, how to know how much of your episodes have been listened to, should you get a sponsor, interviewing callers through a live streaming podcast, and some confusion about launching a podcast, especially to reserve your ideas and start getting them out there. Hey, if you enjoy this content, please subscribe, follow, like whichever platform you're using, and join me on Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern over at theaudacitypodcast.com/live, where I can answer these questions that come in ahead of time, as well as answer questions that come in through the chat room at theaudacitypodcast.com/live on Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern time. So, starting off, first question comes from Jonathan Bloom, who asked, how do I get episode artwork to show? This really depends, and this could change right now, but the general idea is to ensure that your individual episode artwork appears in several places along with your podcast episodes. See, right now in iTunes and the podcast app, the individual artwork will display only when you search for something, and that results in a single episode being listed. That's where, right now, at least in the Apple Podcast directory, that's where the cover art for that individual episode will show. And how the individual episode artwork is different from your main show artwork is, for example, with the Audacity to Podcast. I have the Audacity to Podcast logo and the main show cover art that says simply the Audacity to Podcast. And it has my exclamation point and RSS icon trademark logo there with it. But for individual episodes, I'll design something that's still square, but features an image or icon relevant to the content of that episode, and then the title of the episode is in that cover. And in the corners, bottom corners, you'll see in one corner the Audacity to Podcast logo, and in the other corner, the episode number, so number 315 or something like that. So that's why I create for the individual episodes, but it won't show up in all players. It shows up in some players like Overcast and other players, but maybe not in Apple Podcasts, at least not yet. This could change with iOS 11, but Apple has kind of gone back and forth with how they've supported this. So as of iOS 10, there's no way to make your individual episode image display with that episode while it's being played. While it's playing, the show image will display your main cover art, not the individual episode image. That's different on Overcast, though. On Overcast, when you're looking at your list of podcasts, you'll see the main show image, but then when you press play on an episode, it will play with the image from that episode. So where should those images be? For your individual episodes, there are two places you need to put that image. One is in the ID3 tags of the MP3 file itself. You can add those ID3 tags with iTunes, or my favorite program is ID3 Editor from PA Software, pa-software.com. It's $15, but that purchase was totally worth it. I bought that years ago, and I've continued to receive free updates. And it's worth it because it saves me a bunch of time. I can easily open one MP3 file and copy all of its data over to the other. And I'm not saying like go field by field, copy and paste, but copy everything all at once, paste it to the other, or I can have a template. So I have multiple files that I use as templates. But that aside, oh, and on the Windows side, there's mp3tag.de/en, takes you to the English version of that. That's a free software on the Windows side, but you can use iTunes on either Windows or Mac OS. But when you add that individual image inside the file, make sure that image is smaller than, I'd say smaller than 220 kilobytes. Because of certain compatibility issues in the way that MP3 files are loaded and such, it won't really cause an error on most things now if the image is larger than that. But it can slow down certain things because the way it works, if someone is progressively downloading your file, or sometimes called streaming it, but it's not true streaming, so that's why I put air quotes around that. But if someone is progressively downloading your file, it downloads stuff chronologically. And in an MP3 file, the header data contains the ID3 tags, and that's downloaded first. So if you have, let's exaggerate this, if you have a 5 megabyte image in your ID3 tags, it has to download 5 megabytes of data before it can get to the first bit of audio. So someone may tap play on your episode, not having downloaded it yet. And when they tap play, they have to wait for those 5 megabytes of image data to download before any audio data starts downloading, and then they start hearing the episode. That's not a problem if people download it before they press play. But if they're downloading when they press play, that does become a problem. So that's why it's good to keep that image small. And some older Android apps and some set-top boxes struggle with ID3 tag data that's larger than 256 kilobytes. So that's another reason to keep it small, because that needs to be used for the other data like the episode number, the title, any comments and such, and the image. And the image will take up most of that space. So that's why I recommend you prioritize the file size, not necessarily the resolution. However, some apps like Overcast read the image from the ID3 tags. Desktop iTunes actually reads the image from the ID3 tags for that episode. However, the best way to do this is to put that image in the individual iTunes image tag for each episode. The way to do that would be in whatever is creating your RSS feed. So in Jonathan's case, he gave some more details, and he mentioned that he's using Libsyn to create his RSS feed, and he adds the episode image there. That's the right way to do it if you're using Libsyn's RSS feed. If you're using the PowerPress RSS feed, then what you need to do is go into the PowerPress episode settings and checkmark iTunes image, and then that will display a new iTunes image option for each episode, and you can upload an image there, attach it inside of PowerPress, and publish it. Those images go into your RSS feed. So there, I still recommend that you keep them smaller than 0.5 megabyte, but there you can have more than the 256K limit. And maybe someday you'll be able to go up to 1 megabyte, but I still recommend keep it small. Keep it as small as possible file size wise, but resolution, try and make it 1400 by 1400 or bigger. Those two places, your ID3 tags and in the individual episode iTunes image tag, are where your individual episode images should be for podcast apps to pick it up. But right now, with iOS 10, it doesn't do anything with that image. I hope that with iOS 11, they will do something with that image. Perhaps the reason why they're not decided on how to handle that is that if the image is downloaded, well, that's something extra for the podcast app to have to download and manage if it's downloading an image along with the media file. So it's a little bit more complicated programming, which maybe they'll implement with iOS 11. But for now, with iOS 10, you don't get to see those individual episode images when someone is playing the episode. I hope that changes. Tema Frank said, do you know of any way that we as podcasters can find out on average how much of each episode we publish is listened to? I'd love to know how many make it all the way through and where people tend to drop off if they don't make it all the way through. I think that would be the most useful data for figuring out how long your episode should be. Well, Tema, good news is that speaking of iOS 11, this fall, Apple will be opening up their podcast analytics to all publishers, and it will be through your Podcasts Connect account. That's the website that you'd log into, podcasts, that's plural form, connect.com. Log in with your Apple ID that you used when you submitted your podcast. And eventually, not yet, but in fall 2017, they will have individual episode consumption analytics there so that you can see how much of your episode did people listen to. Did they skip certain portions? And also you can compare certain things like episodes across each other, like how long did it take for this episode to reach its normal plateau or a certain number kind of thing. Some really cool analytics coming out. A few things you need to know. First, this only works if you have access to your podcast in your Podcast Connect account. If someone else submitted the podcast for you, then they have access to your stats. You don't. Do not have your podcast removed from iTunes and then resubmit it in order to have it through your own Podcast Connect account. Apple knows that podcasters will want to see their own stats. So probably around this same time, and this is pure theory on my part, probably around this same time when Apple releases the stats information, they will also have a way for you to transfer ownership of a podcast between Apple ID accounts. They already do that for apps in the App Store. So it makes sense that they would bring that to the podcasts, especially since the only way to see your podcast data from Apple is through Podcast Connect if your podcast is in there, if you're the one that submitted your podcast. Now, years ago, we didn't know that this would be an issue. I even submitted podcasts to Apple for clients, so their podcasts are in my Podcast Connect account. I want to get that moved out of there so that they can see their stats. So if you can't get that information yet, just be patient. So that's one thing to know, is that it's tied to the Apple ID that submitted it, which you may not have access to yet. The other thing to know is that this represents only consumption on the Apple ecosystem. Apple uses the phrase Apple Podcasts. They didn't say iTunes, so we don't know whether this will include desktop iTunes consumption data. It could. It's possible, this is, again, theory on my part, it's possible Apple will release an Apple Podcasts app for desktop, or maybe they'll even do a web app so it could work on everything, including Android and Windows. But so if they do something like that, some kind of standalone desktop or web app, then they'll probably include the consumption analytics from that platform. But if you're concerned about actual iTunes, like desktop iTunes, that's the program called iTunes now, that's a very, very small number of podcast consumption. Most podcast consumption happens on mobile devices. So the Apple Podcasts app, which currently is only on iOS, that accounts for 60 to 70%. Well, Apple's ecosystem, rather, accounts for 60 to 70% of all podcast downloads. And then the podcast app of that, I think, is still within that range, but it's on the lower end. Like iTunes represents maybe, I think, 4 or 5%, 3 to 5%, I think, of a total consumption of a podcast. So the point is that although this won't let you see the consumption data for your entire audience, this will let you see it for the majority of your audience. And considering that this is the #1 podcast app, and that the people who consume through this app are most likely average type of consumers, then I think this will give you a really good picture of how your podcasts are consumed. And even if you have a lot of subscribers with other apps like Overcast or Beyond Pod or Pocket Cast or things like that, my theory is that, and I know I'm talking about theories a lot, it's because we don't have data yet, but my theory is that if someone is subscribed to a podcast with something other than Apple Podcasts or some built-in app, if they've gone out and they've picked a program, a podcast app to use, that their consumption behavior might be different. It might even be deeper. That's the word I'm looking for. It might even be deeper than their consumption data through Apple Podcasts. Pure theory on my part. There's no data to back that up, but it's just my thinking that if someone is willing to invest in finding a better podcast app, they're probably also more interested and invested in the podcast they subscribe to, so they listen to them more faithfully. Now, this data, what you can do with it, and when we have this data to actually see, I'll do an episode on the Audacity-to-podcast.com more about what you can learn from this. But something that Tema said is, she said, I think that would be the most useful data for figuring out how long your episode should be. My response to that is no, not really. You'll see a lot of people, especially radio people, come to that conclusion that, oh, because people stop listening 15 minutes in, therefore our podcast should be only 15 minutes long. That's completely the wrong conclusion to make. And this isn't your fault, Tema. I understand this is easy to think that way, but you have to look deeper at the actual situation. what happens 15 minutes in? Well, 15 minutes, there's a 2-minute commercial, maybe. Okay, that makes sense. Maybe people know, oh, it's a really long commercial, and whatever else comes after this commercial isn't all that interesting, so I want to just bail on this entire episode. So then it has nothing to do with the length of the episode in itself. It's about how the episode is formatted and where content is and the value of that content. Someone like Dan Carlin, who hosts the Hardcore History podcast, releases really long podcast episodes. And he's one of those that breaks many rules. And sometimes I wonder, if he didn't break so many rules, would his podcast be successful? But we don't currently have a parallel universe split testing machine, so we'll never actually know. But his podcast episodes release inconsistently, but they're very long episodes. His most recent episode from a few months ago was the first time I actually listened to an episode. And I think it was 5 hours long, 4 or 5 hours, maybe it was 3 hours, whatever the case. I don't remember how long it was. And I didn't mind how long it was. It was very long, but it was very good content. I'm a military brat. I grew up with my dad in the Air Force and siblings who have been interested in the armed forces. So when Dan Carlin released an episode about nuclear warfare, that really interested me, and I was so totally wrapped up in that podcast. I didn't listen to it all in one sitting. I listened to it across many listening sessions, but I didn't skip any of the episode. I didn't stop the episode and move on to something else. I came back, and I listened to the entire thing. So the episode at all was not too long. I have no complaint about the length of the episode because it was good content the entire time. So when you see that people start bailing at certain points, that doesn't mean that's how long your episode should be. That means something is happening around that point in your episode that's inspiring people to leave. Maybe it's you start giving your closing calls to action and they know, okay, they're giving the closing, there's nothing else I need to listen to after this. So they bail. So even if you make your episode shorter, if you still have 3 minutes of closing calls to action, then people will still bail from your podcast episodes 3 minutes before the end. And you then might start to think, oh, 15 minutes is too long. No, 12 minutes is too long. No, 9 minutes is too long. When it's not the length that's the problem, it's the content or how you're presenting that content. So watch out for when you see public radio people say, oh, episodes should only be this long because we're seeing that people stop listening after this long. You have to dig into the full details of maybe their episodes stop being good after that many minutes. So you can learn from this, certainly, when you see how much of your episode is listened to. But that doesn't mean it's about length. It could be more about content. It could be about your presentation. It could be about calls to action. It could be about the value that you are or not giving to your audience. So don't rush to that assumption that it's about the length. Rush to the assumption to not assume. Dig deeper into your episodes and figure out what happened at that point that might be inspiring people to leave. A podcast that I think does a pretty good job of keeping you listening the entire time is the $100 MBA podcast, which used to be a 5-day-a-week podcast. Now it's a once-a-week podcast with longer episodes. But the format is still the same. And that is where he introduces himself in the podcast. He gives a teaser and a little teaser about what's to come. Then he says, let's get down to business, and he doesn't. And then he goes to ads, and then he comes back to content. So I do skip the ads because it's the same ads over and over, and they're very scripted. They're not very dynamic. So I do skip those ads. But then he gets into his content. He comes to the very end, maybe some kind of summary, and he says, I've got something more to share with you about this, but before that, and then he does a sponsor spot, and then he comes back and shares a little bit more content or a summary or an application of some sort, and then he closes. So it's getting you to listen all the way to the end because you know there's something near the end. Marvel movies, okay? They have made it popular to watch the credits again because people want to see what's at the end of the credits. As a personal policy, I always stay for the credits of movies. For one thing, I enjoy the soundtracks often. And another thing, I want to see, is there anything at the end? And also, I respect the people who made the movies. So you can learn ways to make your podcast better from the kind of consumption data that you'll get from Apple Podcasts when they release that in fall of 2017. From the live chat, Gail Simon asked or said, first, thanks for all you do. You have made a big difference in my life. Okay, so did you go with Themify? Recently, I've been receiving emails from iThemes. I'm in the process of building my podcast website, have Themify, Bluehost, now configuring. Thanks. Also, are you using 2 cameras right now? So a couple questions in here. Did I go with Themify? Yes. A couple of my websites are already running on Themify. Podcastersociety.com and mypodcastreviews.com are now running on Themify. The Audacity to podcast.com has not yet been redesigned. I really wanted to get the new logo out, and the new logo is now out. It's been designed for almost a year, but I finally pushed it out there. And the website design has been sitting as well for about a year, but I've just had other things that I haven't switched to yet. And that website design, though, isn't on Themify, specifically the Themify Ultra theme, and I've modified it with some other code and CSS and stuff. So I do like the Themify theme builder and such. Divi, I think, is easier, but Themify is more powerful. If you already have Themify, you don't have to switch to Divi or something else like that. iThemes makes some other stuff, plugins and some themes. Like iThemes makes Backup Buddy, which is really good. And by the way, if you want to know more about some podcast themes that you should consider, or themes that work well for podcasting, go to the audacitytopodcast.com/WordPress themes. And I will make sure that link actually works because I can't remember if is it WP themes. It's WordPress themes. Yes. The audacitytopodcast.com/WordPress themes will take you to my episode. When you listen to the episode, there is a theme that you won't see mentioned in the show notes. Well, actually, I do say Appendipity has been removed from this list. I no longer recommend Appendipity themes. And at this time, I won't go into detail why that is, but just I don't recommend them anymore. Themify, Divi, StudioPress, that's what I recommend. So you said, I'm in the process of building my podcast website. Themify will work great for you. You can use PowerPress along with it. You can use Smart Podcast Player or Simple Podcast Press. What makes a theme a podcast theme is if you add a player. And the easiest way to do that is with PowerPress. Now, some themes, like this is what I did like about Appendipity, is they integrated with PowerPress so that when you activate PowerPress and you add a podcast episode, a nicely designed player would display in the theme. I wish more theme developers would do that. But even if they didn't, you could use the built-in PowerPress theme. You could style it yourself, or built-in PowerPress player, that is. You could style it yourself. You could use Simple Podcast Press with promo code Noodle, and that gives you a better-looking player on your website for those who visit your website and want to be able to press play as soon as they get there. And the other question that Gail asked is, am I using 2 cameras right now? No, right now I'm using only 1 camera. It's my web camera. It's a Logitech C920, which is still a great camera. And what's making it look good, because some people think, whoa, that camera looks amazing. It's not the camera itself, although the camera is really good. It's the lighting, because if I was in standard room lighting, it's lighting and manual controls. So what I'm going to do right now is turn the camera to default mode. Did it change to default? There we go. Turn to default mode, and now you see how it's automatically overexposing me, even though I'm using professional lights. But if I turn off my studio lights and turn on my room lights, this is how the video would look. Now it looks cheap, right? It's not a difference of the camera. It's a difference in the lighting. because when you have really good lighting, the camera doesn't have to work as hard to expose everything in the set. And then if you use some of the manual controls, like I do with webcam settings on Mac OS, you can then dial down the exposure, because especially with so much black behind me, the camera thinks, oh, this is dark, it needs to be exposed higher. And then there's just this little bit of white in front, which is me. And then it ends up overexposing that. So that's why I like the manual control. So I can customize the exposure, saturation, color balance, and that kind of thing. And then it ends up looking great. And it looks good because primarily the lighting and the manual controls with that lighting. And that's with the Logitech C920. I do have two cameras, two C920s. And when I'm live streaming with a co-host, I have one camera pointed at them, one camera pointed at me, and then I switch it back and forth with our software so that you can see both of us, depending on when we're talking. And sometimes I forget to switch, so you'll see the other person just sitting there as I'm doing the one talking, but you're seeing their face because I forgot to switch the camera. And that's happened many, many times. So it's tough to try and remember to switch it myself, but it is possible to do that with software like Wirestream, vMix, OBS, CamTwist Studio, Ecamm, and software like that. Next question. So thank you for the question, Gail. And Gail is in the chat right now. Next question came in from Nathan Benilla Warford. And he said, I'm an eye doctor, and I was talking about the patient-centric podcast to a contact lens representative, and he immediately said they could sponsor it. Since my practice is the, quote, sponsor, unquote, I'm not sure if sponsoring the podcast would shake the legitimacy or somehow enhance it. It probably would increase the traffic because people in the company might be interested, and they might even tell other doctors. So the question is, should I get the sponsor? This really depends, because there is that aspect of, if that contact lens company is sponsoring the podcast, they might be more interested to tell their customers about it. How much does that really help, though? It may or may not. It really depends on how they do it. It's like I could have the president, well, let's not go that far because that's obvious celebrity, but I could have a famous podcaster on the Audacity to podcast. Let's say Joe Rogan, for example, or Mark Maron. I could have them on the Audacity to podcast. And they bring a lot of celebrity status with them. But having them merely on the podcast doesn't make the podcast get any more popularity. But if they share it with their audience, then it might get more popularity and more people might check it out. But especially if they tell their audience, you should go listen to my guest appearance on this podcast, or they send it in their email list. They engage their audience around it and recommend that they listen to it. They don't merely reshare it. They suggest it. That's when it becomes more powerful, but I can't depend on that. So with a sponsor, it's very similar. You can't depend on them to publicize your podcast. That could be part of your contract, though, with them. You could say, all right, you can sponsor us for this price, and we'll provide code for you. We ask that you embed that on your website, and you email it out to your subscribers, or you share it on all of your social accounts when the episode's published that you're sponsoring. And you can provide the suggested messages for them to do that, so that it's in their voice. Make sure you do it that way. So they're saying we instead of referring to themselves in the third person. And that could then get your podcast in front of their audience if they have much of an audience. But then again, they might not. I wear contact lenses. I've worn contact lenses for almost 20 years. I have no idea who makes my contact lenses or who's made any of them. I'm not on the company's email lists. I don't go to the company's websites. So if my contact lens company was sponsoring a podcast, I would have no idea that they were doing that because I'm not connected with my contact lens company. So you did say here, so I think you're understanding the same thing. You did say, because people in the company might be interested and they might even tell other doctors. That's a slight chance, yes. But it really depends. And it's kind of about who is your ideal audience. Is your audience other doctors or is your audience patients? You said it's a patient-centric podcast. So to trust that the sponsor is going to tell other doctors who will then in turn tell other patients is a little bit of a stretch. Nonetheless, a contact lens company would seem like a great sponsor for a podcast that is patient-centric because you could tell your audience, ask your eye doctor about these lenses or here are the benefits of these lenses and why you should consider these for your next contact lenses. So there could be benefit in it to your audience for sure. And the other thing that you said is, would it shake the legitimacy or somehow enhance it? It could do a little bit of both. So let me liken this to my own situation. I've had sponsors for the Audacity to podcast before. I won't again in the future unless I'm absolutely convinced it makes sense. Like, for example, in the last couple of years, I had a sponsor that was Harry's Razors. Now, what does that have to do with podcasting? I made it relevant. I had an episode about getting yourself ready for video podcasting, and I talked about how shaving is an important part, especially, guys, we're the ones more concerned about facial hair. So shave your facial hair and like neck hair and all of that. Don't make it look like your face is dirty and make sure you have a clean shave. And I talked about Harry's in the context of that. And that was one of several points. So it fit with that episode. But when in the early days of the Audacity to podcast, I had the sponsor like GoToMeeting or GoToMyPC, didn't really make sense. And even today, if Electro Voice came to me, as much as I love the company, if Electro Voice came to me and, okay, now actually, let me make this totally relevant. SiteGround. That's the company I recommend for web hosting. The audacitytopodcast.com/SiteGround is my affiliate link if you want to sign up for them. I have a good relationship with them. I know people in the company. I recommend them because I have tried them. I've tested them, and I've been impressed with the results. They are not owned by this major conglomerate company that owns Bluehost, Site5, HostGator, HostMonster, a lot of these hosting companies. I don't get paid as much for affiliate sales from SiteGround as I would if I recommended HostGator or Bluehost, but I'm more confident in the product and in the company. And that's why I've chosen to recommend them instead of those other companies. So SiteGround has asked me several times about sponsoring an episode of the Audacity to Podcast. And that could still happen someday in the future. But I'd much rather it be an affiliate relationship where I recommend the product when it's relevant and in context, and it's a genuine recommendation. And I get paid based on the performance. Not just paid for mentioning it, but paid if someone uses it because I think they should, because it's a great service. I've tested it. It works really well. The reason I don't want it to accept sponsors anymore is because if I'm going to do an ad spot in my podcast, I have my own stuff to sell. So why should I be promoting someone else as a sponsor when I'm the sponsor of my own content? So I would much rather tell you to join Podcaster Society than to get a website on Bluehost or HostGator or SiteGround or any of them. Now, it might even be more profitable for you to join Podcaster Society than for the other things. It's more likely that you would join Podcaster Society than you would get your web hosting because maybe you already have web hosting from one of these companies or you're happy with where you're hosting. In your case, Nathan, your audience might be beyond your actual business area. If you have a business that only serves a local clientele, but your audience is global, then a sponsor could make sense, because then that can monetize an audience that you might never be able to monetize directly. But if you have your own thing to sell, I recommend that you do that instead of have a sponsor. When I've listened to, and there are other podcasts about podcasting that have had sponsors at different points, and it just didn't sit right. It didn't sound right because the podcaster had their own thing to sell and they're advertising someone else's thing to sell. So it was a little bit strange to me, even though it wasn't a conflict of interest. It just didn't seem right. Like, I would rather hear about your thing to sell than someone else's thing to sell. So those are some let me say that again. Those are some things for you to consider, Nathan, for your specific situation and what seems best for your podcast and for your audience, to serve your audience. And I know the temptation of basically free money is really big, but make sure it's providing value to your audience, not only value to yourself and to the company. Before I go on with the further questions, I want to tell you about the next episode of the Audacity to Podcast. Episode 316 will publish on August 1st, 2017, and it is about how you can use the new Apple Podcast tags, the new iTunes title, the episode number, the season, the episode type, the show type, and some of that other stuff that's coming out. How you can start using that today so that you will be prepared when iOS 11 releases and podcasts will start displaying differently inside of the podcast app. So I talk about primarily Libsyn and Blueberry, or Libsyn and PowerPress, since those are the two places I recommend you get your RSS feed. But I also mentioned some guidance on where you might want to look for setting that information if you use something else to create your RSS feed. And if whatever you use to create your podcast RSS feed does not have support for those new Apple tags by the time iOS 11 is released, I say ditch that company, because they've had enough advanced warning. And look at Blueberry and Libsyn. Blueberry even had their support earlier than Libsyn did. Blueberry had draft support almost immediately, but they wanted to make sure they went through thorough testing and stuff. And Libsyn had to do some development stuff, but they're both months early. It's at least 2 months probably from when iOS 11 releases. So Blueberry and Libsyn are on top of things. Blueberry with their own service as well as through PowerPress. So there's still 2 months before this comes out. And SoundCloud, I don't think, is going to support it. We'll see if any of the other podcast hosting companies implement their support. But if your company doesn't support it by the time it's available, then you need to leave that company, because it shows that they're not on top of things enough. They're waiting too long, or they're not in touch with the industry. So that's the Audacity to Podcast episode 316 over at theaudacitytopodcast.com. And I'll talk in that about how you can change those settings and give a little bit more guidance on what some of those settings should be, how you can use them. Continuing on with the questions. Jeff said, I'm starting up a live talk show style podcast where I will be interviewing callers. Ideally, I would like this to be streamed live on Facebook. I'm having difficulties with the production setup to pull this off. I was hoping to use Facebook Audio Live. However, this feature is only available on mobile. Do you have any suggestions? Yes, I do. So first, Facebook Live audio only version is currently available only if you broadcast from mobile devices. Probably at some point they'll support that on desktops, but for now it's only through the mobile app. So what you can do, and Jeff had included a theory about this inside of his email as well. What you can do is connect your mixer to your mobile device. And the way that you do that is with a TRRS cable. So that would be something like this, a little hard to see, but it has 3 stripes inside of it instead of 2. A normal stereo headphones has 2. This has 3. So it's tip, ring, sleeve. And one of those extra connection points is for a microphone to go into something. So if you look at your Apple earbuds or some kind of thing like that that has a microphone and headphones, you'll see the same kind of thing. It's TRRS. So what you need is a splitter, a TRRS splitter, sometimes called an iPod AV cable. And you can connect that to your mixer. And normally it would be the yellow line that goes from your mixer to the input of the phone. And you don't have to connect the other things unless you're taking and sending phone calls through that same device. But for live streaming, you simply need to tap into the main mix from your mixer, and that goes out to the phone. It doesn't have to be a mix minus because all that the phone is doing is streaming the audio for you. It's not handling your phone callers as well. Or it could be your mobile device, like a tablet or an iPod Touch or something like that. Android, iOS, whatever. So you've got output going from your mixer into the phone, and then through your computer or some other mobile device, you're handling the calls. Doing a live call-in show can be really tricky because you might not get any calls. So you need to make sure that you have enough of an audience that's engaged enough and can be present to participate in this kind of thing, because you don't want to be the podcast that 20 minutes out of your 30-minute episode is you simply saying, okay, everybody, here's the number. Go ahead and call in. Anytime. Anytime. I see people in the chat room. Hey, Jim. Hey, Steve. Hey, Gail. Good to see you in the chat room. So someone call in. Call in sometime, anytime. That's just wasting your audience's time. So there are ways to work around that. Like maybe you could edit things with what you edit, what you publish. Maybe you don't include the number, or maybe you tell people to show up live so that they can call in. But always have a monologue prepared. And it would be great if you could have someone in the chat room then for you, or maybe you've copied something and you just paste it every now and then by yourself. And that is the announcement to say, I'm taking live callers, call in with this number or Skype this thing or something like that, so that people could join you as well. And if no one joins you, then you wrap up your episode and you never say anything that devalues your audience in some way, like, oh, man, no one called today. I guess no one cared about the podcast. That wouldn't be the thing to do. But try to bring them in organically. Now, as far as software to do this, you could use Hangouts, you could use Google Voice, you could use Skype, you could use a software like Blog Talk Radio or Call-In Studio or Uber Conference or Zoom or GoToMeeting or anything like that can connect through your computer or mobile device. You will have to set up a mix minus for whatever device is handling that call. And what's cool with some of these other things like Blog Talk Radio or Call-In Studio, I think is the other one. These things can have a screener. So maybe you have someone in the other room who answers the phone, finds out what the person wants to say, or make sure that they're a legitimate caller. Then they put them on a hold. And then from your computer, you can answer it. And you see a little note to say, this is Joe from Washington. He wants to talk about such and such, whatever. That way you can be prepared for that caller, and you know it's an actual caller coming in. So that can work. That needs to run on a device separate from what's handling the live stream for you. And it is possible to do. You just need to have that mix minus, and a mix minus is sending the mix of all of your audio, so your voice, any sound effects that you're playing, minus your caller's audio, so they're not hearing themselves sent back to them. By the way, one of those things to tell them ahead of time is that as soon as they join the call, to stop playback or mute whatever they were using to listen, because a lot of people don't realize there's a delay. On the internet side, it's because of just the way technology works. But on the radio side, there was a delay because of wanting to be able to censor things that might come through. So some people will call in and expect that they can listen through their computer speakers, and then it starts to become a very awkward conversation as they're hearing themselves coming back, and it's very delayed. So make sure that you tell them mute your speakers or mute the player when you're connected. And that would be in your written instructions for that. But when you have that mix minus set up, that can handle taking the caller, sending them your audio, your music, anything like that, but not sending their own voice back to them. Gail Simon posted in the chat room a nice reminder, and this is a reminder as well, that voting is still, nominations are still open at podcastawards.com, but that's only through July 31st, 2017. So you might be watching this later and nominations are closed. And if you want to support our own podcasts, we'd really appreciate it. We have 3 podcasts, and the nomination process is super simple. You go to podcastawards.com, create an account, then you select the podcast you want to nominate from the different categories. Under business, we have Beyond the To-Do List. Under technology is the Audacity to Podcast, and under TV and film is Once Upon a Time podcast. Those 3 podcasts, pick anything else you want to nominate for the different categories, save your nominations, and that's all you have to do. No more daily voting. You don't have to type our podcast names. You don't have to paste a website address or anything like that. You just go nominate and you're done. Super easy this year. It's really nice. So that's at podcastawards.com. And Gail said she was voting for us. And thank you very much for that. We really, really appreciate that. Last question that I've got, unless someone else posts a question in the chat. John said, I've recently purchased rights to a premium domain name that I hope to use for a podcast as my website continues to grow. I want to establish podcast channels now in an attempt to protect my ideas from being acted upon by someone else. It seems that establishing a channel on SoundCloud without prior content was easy enough, but when it comes to Stitcher and Google Play, it seems as though setting up your own channel is impossible until you actually have a steady stream of content that you're ready to upload right then and there. Is my thinking here correct? And if not, could you please take a moment to school me? Thank you for the question, John. The thinking is not quite correct. You're close, and you've noticed certain things, but not quite. First of all, don't use SoundCloud at all. Unless you have extra money to waste to put your podcast on SoundCloud, don't use SoundCloud. Use something else. Use Libsyn, use Blueberry, use Spreaker, use Podbean. Promo code Noodle will give you a free month with any of those companies, by the way. But stay away from SoundCloud. They will be a waste of time, waste of money. They are not a good podcast hosting platform, and they may even stop being a podcast hosting platform altogether, because everything that they've said about continuing, they've been talking about music. Your music will live on. Our music service will continue. We love the music. They said nothing about podcasts. So I really think they'll stop supporting podcasters, which they kind of already did years ago. But get off of SoundCloud. Don't even bother with SoundCloud. That said, to get into podcast apps, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, Beyond Pod, Overcast, any podcast app, to get in, you have to already have a podcast. To have a podcast, you need to have an RSS feed with at least one episode downloadable. So you need to record an episode and publish it, and then you submit your RSS feed to these different places so that your podcast can be out there with your episodes. But the other thing about what you said, you want to protect your ideas from being acted upon by someone else. First of all, the likelihood of that happening are very low. Secondly, depending on what those ideas are, it's not really something that you can necessarily protect. For example, a podcast about podcasting. Okay, there are a bunch of other podcasts about podcasting. I have no right to say, oh, because I started a podcast about podcasting, you can't start one, or you're infringing on my rights, or I'm protecting my idea by publishing a podcast about podcasting. No, what I do by getting my content out first is I might be the first one to talk about that content. But that doesn't mean that anyone else who talks about the content is infringing somehow on my rights. They're talking about a subject. you may be talking about a subject. Now, if someone is copying what you're doing, that's when it could be a concern. So starting to try and protect your ideas or prevent them from being acted upon from someone else, that might not even happen, but it's not even guaranteed that by your starting that you can actually do that. I mean, I've got a couple domains for a podcast I'm still thinking about doing this fall, but I'm not sure if I will. But just because I have the great domains doesn't mean that I'm protecting the idea. Someone else might do my same idea or might talk about the same thing, and I can't prevent them from doing that. I have no legal action to prevent them from talking about the same content. So the main thing is get your podcast started. Just don't worry about these protecting your ideas or things like that or the fear. Get your podcast out there so that people can hear it and appreciate it. And start with at least one episode so that then you can submit to the podcast apps and directories. And please, for your good, stay away from SoundCloud because it's just a mess over there. It's been a mess for years, really. And they are not good at serving podcasters, really. So stay away from SoundCloud, please. And you won't regret staying away from SoundCloud. SoundCloud is not a distribution platform. Being on SoundCloud does not mean you'll get an extra audience, or even starting a channel on SoundCloud doesn't mean you're protecting your ideas. It just means you have something that no one has seen over there. So promote your own platform, your own website, point people there. Don't say, go listen to us on SoundCloud. Say, listen to me on my website. Go to whatever my website is, .com, and press play on the episode. All right, that's it for today's podcasting Q&A. Coming up is the Zoom H6 for Podcasters course. It is almost finished. I'm in the editing right now where it's starting to get the most complicated, and I'll be jumping right back to that after I finish this Q&A. But I'm talking about how to do a mix minus with the Zoom H6. Yes, you can do a mix minus. You can actually do 2 mix minuses with the Zoom H6, and the Zoom H6 can do some other really amazing things for podcasters. So that will be a premium course for podcasters. And if you're on my email list, which you can join through many different buttons over at theaudacitytopodcast.com, you'll get the opportunity to pre-order that course at a discount. And Podcaster Society members will get access to that course for free, though. And that will be releasing very soon. So early August, that will be available. And Podcaster Society will be reopened soon as well, in case that's your most interesting option to use so that you get access to that course as well as many others. And on my public side with videos, I've got a video review of the Mix Pre 6 coming out very soon. The video has already been recorded, edited. I just need to give it the final approval and publish it. So watch for that at theaudacitypodcast.com or on Facebook and YouTube. All of those links, everything I've mentioned, is available at theaudacitypodcast.com. So now that I've given you some of the guts and taught you some of the tools, it's time for you to go launch or improve your own podcast for sharing your passions and finding success. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from theaudacitypodcast.com. Thanks for watching.